Timeline of TV-related stuff. Here's a more detailed timeline of the evolution of local news, pre-20th century 1690, public occurrences both foreign and domestic. The first multi-page newspaper in the American colonies was published in Boston. 1704, the Boston Newsletter, the first continuously published newspaper in America, began publishing, with local news as a major focus. 1740s 1800s, newspapers like the New York Gazette and the Pennsylvania Packet expanded, often reporting on local issues alongside national and international news. 19th century, advancements in printing technology made newspapers cheaper and more accessible. Local papers became common in towns and cities, covering community events, crime, politics, and business. Early 20th century 1920, KDKA in Pittsburgh became the first commercial radio station, providing live local news coverage. 1930s 1940s, radio news expanded rapidly, with stations airing regular updates on local weather, traffic, and events. Local stations served as critical communication hubs during the Great Depression and World War II. 1948, television broadcasting began to expand, with local stations like WBKB, Chicago, introducing daily news programming. Mid-20th century 1950s, local TV news gained popularity as stations like WNBC in New York City established dedicated news teams. This decade also saw the emergence of the anchor role. 1960s, the growth of network affiliates allowed for localized news coverage tied to national broadcasts. Stations like KTVU, San Francisco, pioneered investigative reporting on local issues. Late 1960s, the action news format was introduced, emphasizing fast-paced, visually engaging stories. Late 20th century 1970s, advances in satellite technology allowed local stations to cover larger geographic areas and include live field reports. 1980s, cable news networks like CNN debuted but sparked competition for audience attention. Local news adapted by increasing focus on hyperlocal topics. 1990s, the Internet became a significant platform, with newspapers and TV stations creating online editions. Innovations like real-time weather radars and local sports updates became key features. 21st century 2000s, local news embraced digital formats, creating mobile apps and leveraging early social media platforms to reach broader audiences. The decline of print circulation led many newspapers to focus on online revenue streams. 2010s, hyperlocal journalism surged, supported by digital platforms that allowed even small neighborhoods to have dedicated coverage. Social media and video streaming platforms like Facebook Live became tools for breaking news coverage. 2020s, the COVID-19 pandemic highlighted the importance of local news and public health messaging. Local outlets increasingly used AI and analytics to tailor news content. However, newsroom consolidations and closures became a growing challenge. Streaming services also began to integrate local news broadcasts. Here is a more detailed timeline of the history and development of HDTV, 1930s and 1940s. Early concepts and experiments. 1936, the term high definition was first used to describe television systems that exceeded 200 lines of resolution, such as the BBC's 405-line system, considered advanced for its time. 1949, Vladimir Kazarikhin patented concepts for higher resolution imaging tubes, laying groundwork for future HDTV development. 1960s, initial higher resolution research. 1964, NHK, Japan Broadcasting Corporation, began early experiments with HD, aiming to improve broadcast quality significantly beyond the NTSC system. 1969, Apollo 11 moon landing showcased advancements in video transmission, sparking interest in improving broadcast standards. 1970s, development of early HD standards. 1972, NHK achieved a significant breakthrough with the development of a 1,125-line, 60 Hz interlaced video system, the basis for future HDTV. 1979, NHK conducted the first public demonstration of high-definition video, showcasing increased clarity over analog TV systems. 1980s, High Definition Innovation. 1981, NHK and Sony demonstrated a 1,125 line HD system at a resolution of 1035 horizontal lines to international audiences. 1983, the European community began developing its own HD TV system, MAC, multiplexed analog components, to compete with Japan's NHK. 1987, the US FCC created the Advisory Committee on Advanced Television Services to explore HD broadcasting. 1989, Japan began experimental HD broadcasting using an analog muse system. 1990s, standardization and early commercialization. 1990, NHK launched the first commercial HD satellite broadcasts in Japan using the Muse system. 1991, AT&T and Zenith in the U.S. began collaborating on digital HD TV transmission standards. 1993, the Digital HD TV Grand Alliance, a coalition of U.S. companies, was established to develop a unified HD TV standard. 1996, the FCC approved the ATSC standard for digital HD TV in the U.S., establishing a framework for widescreen aspect ratios, 16:9, and higher resolutions. 1998, major U.S. networks, for example, CBS, PBS, and NBC, aired the first digital HD TV broadcasts. 2000s, adoption and mainstream success. 2000, HD TV sets entered the consumer market at prices between $5,000 and $10,000. Adoption was initially slow due to high costs. 2002, DirecTV and Dish Network began offering HD channels, accelerating consumer interest. 2003, ESPN and Discovery launched full-time HD channels, increasing the availability of HD programming. 2005, prices of HD TVs began dropping significantly, leading to increased household penetration. 2006, analog TVs were phased out in several countries, including the U.S., in preparation for digital-only broadcasts. 2009, the U.S. completed its transition to digital broadcasting, marking a key milestone in HD TV adoption. 2010s, HD becomes the standard. 2010, HD TV was adopted as the global standard for new televisions, with flat-panel LCD and plasma displays dominating the market. 2013, introduction of Ultra HD, 4K, resolution TVs brought even higher resolution to consumers, though HD remained the most widely used format. 2016, High Dynamic Range, HDR, was introduced for HD and UHD TVs, improving color and contrast. 2017, cable and streaming services like Netflix and Amazon began offering HD and 4K streaming options as default formats. 2020s, the rise of UHD and advanced technologies. 2020, 4K became the standard for premium TVs, with 8K displays entering the market at high prices. 2022, HDR10 Plus and Dolby Vision HDR formats became standard features in HD and UHD TV''s. 2024, advanced technologies like Mini LED and OLED continued to enhance HD and UHD picture quality. Here's a timeline outlining the evolution of the TV infomercial. 1949, the early days. The first official infomercial aired in the United States after the FCC lifted restrictions on television advertising duration. It was primarily used to sell household products. 1950s, rise of TV shopping companies like Vitamix pioneered the concept of demonstrating products live on television to showcase their functionality. 1970s, expanded use infomercials began targeting niche markets, selling everything from fitness equipment to self-help books. Products like the Ginsu knife became iconic. 1980s, golden era infomercials gained mainstream popularity with fitness products like Jane Fonda's Workout and the Thigh Master. The 1984 Cable Communications Policy Act allowed cable channels to air longer ads, paving the way for 30-minute infomercials. 1990s, Late-night boom. With the growth of cable television, infomercials became a staple of late-night programming, featuring products like the George Foreman Grill and Ronco Showtime Rotisserie. Tony Robbins and other motivational speakers used infomercials to promote their programs. 2000s, QVC and home shopping networks. The rise of dedicated shopping networks like QVC and HSN expanded the reach and legitimacy of infomercials. Products like Proactive used celebrity endorsements to gain credibility. 2010s, digital integration. Infomercials adapted to the internet age with hybrid approaches, combining TV airings with online sales strategies. Viral products like the Snuggie and ShamWow thrived through a mix of TV and social media marketing. 2020s, decline and transformation. The rise of streaming services and on-demand content reduced traditional TV infomercial viewership. Infomercial-style advertising shifted to platforms like YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok, where long-form demonstrations still resonate with audiences. Infomercials remain a nostalgic and enduring format, evolving with the media landscape while retaining their core emphasis on storytelling and product demonstration. 4. The clock ident was a staple of television broadcasting, particularly during the analog era, and had its own timeline depending on the region or network. Here's a general timeline of its evolution. 1940s to 1950s, early development. The concept of the clock ident began with the advent of regular TV broadcasting. Early clock idents were used to show the exact time and often featured simple analog clock faces. In the UK, the BBC began using clock idents in the late 1940s as part of their presentation style, primarily for transitions between programs and news bulletins. 1960s, expansion and refinement. Broadcasters worldwide adopted clock idents as part of their branding and to fill gaps in the schedule. Designs became more refined, with some incorporating logos and animations. 1970s and 1980s, iconic designs. The clock ident became an iconic part of television. Networks like the BBC introduced more stylized versions, often tied to their branding. Digital clock overlays became more common as technology improved. In some regions, color was introduced to the clock ident as color TV became the standard. 1990s, decline in use as 24-hour broadcasting became the norm. The need for clock idents diminished. They were primarily used for news bulletins or during transitions into late-night programming. Some broadcasters, like the BBC, phased them out in favor of other branding tools. 2000s to present, nostalgia and limited-use clock idents largely disappeared, replaced by on-screen graphics and other branding elements. In the UK, the BBC briefly reintroduced the clock ident in 2016 on its BBC Two network as part of a nostalgia campaign. Clock idents remain a beloved relic of television history and are occasionally referenced or revived for special occasions. Here's a general timeline for the development and usage of news takers. 1920s 1930s, early experiments with scrolling text and live news transmission occurred, but not in the form of modern news takers. The concept of live updates on television came into focus in the 1930s with the advent of regular news broadcasts. 1950s 1960s, as television broadcasting became more common, some news programs began to experiment with static text on screen for additional information, but these were not yet continuous scrolling takers. 1970s, the first use of scrolling news takers emerged. These were mostly used in specialized formats like financial markets, providing real-time stock quotes. This technology began to be adapted for general news by the late 1970s. 1980s, CNN, cable news network, launched in 1980 and became the first major cable news outlet to use continuous scrolling news takers. This feature provided rolling updates on breaking news, weather, and stock market information. 1990s, with the rise of 24-hour news networks and the Internet, news takers became more widespread. News outlets such as MSNBC and the BBC adopted the format, providing continuous text updates on screen. Financial news takers, like those on Bloomberg and CNBC, became prominent during this time. 2000s, the usage of news takers expanded, with real-time updates on breaking news, sports, and entertainment becoming common across all news networks. The integration of more dynamic content such as social media feeds and tweets began to appear in tickers. 2010s present, news tickers continue to be a standard part of television broadcasts, especially in breaking news situations. However, they've evolved with digital formats and the rise of streaming services, where tickers are often integrated into lower thirds or graphics packages. News tickers are also used in apps, websites, and news aggregators to provide real-time updates across platforms. This timeline is a general overview, focusing on news tickers' most prominent uses and technological milestones. 4omany, an owned and operated station is a television or radio station that is directly owned by a network or media company, rather than being independently owned or affiliated with the network. Here's a general timeline for the development and evolution of such stations. 1920s and 1940s, early broadcast development. 1920s, radio stations begin to emerge in the U.S., with companies and networks starting to develop owned and operated stations as they build national networks. 1930s, major networks like NBC, CBS, and ABC, which was formed from the NBC Blue Network, start establishing their own stations in major cities to expand their reach and control over content distribution. 1950s and 1960s, expansion of TV networks. 1950s, television networks, such as NBC, CBS, and ABC, start launching their own OO stations to support the growth of TV broadcast. 1960s, more local affiliates are established, with networks continuing to expand their presence across the country, reinforcing the concept of OO stations. 1970s and 1980s, consolidation and deregulation. 1970s, as TV networks grow, they begin owning more stations in key markets, thus controlling a larger share of the broadcasting landscape. 1980s, FCC regulations begin to loosen, and networks like NBC, ABC, and CBS begin consolidating more stations, making them key players in local TV broadcasting. 1990s to 2000s, digital expansion and cable networks. 1990s, with the rise of cable television and satellite networks, traditional OO stations expand their presence through digital channels and start experimenting with cable broadcast and syndication. 2000s, networks like Fox, NBC, and CBS expand their OO stations into digital platforms and web channels, setting the stage for modern multi-platform broadcasting. 2010s to present, shift to multi-platform media. 2010s, the proliferation of streaming services like Hulu, YouTube, and others changes the broadcasting landscape. OO stations adapt by focusing on online content, digital streaming, and social media interaction. 2020s, OO stations continue to operate on both traditional broadcasting channels and digital platforms, with networks like Universal, CBS, and Fox expanding their digital and streaming operations. OO stations are integral in controlling and shaping the content that goes out over national networks, and their role in the media landscape continues to evolve with digital transformation and shifting media consumption habits. 4omany, a cold open is a storytelling technique commonly used in television, film, and other media. Here's a general timeline of its use. Early 20th century, 1910s and 1930s, cold opens begin to appear in radio dramas and early films as a means to quickly capture the audience's attention before the title sequence or main story begins. Early cold opens typically involved a direct scene, mystery, or action that engaged listeners or viewers. 1950s and 1960s, cold opens become more common in television, especially in crime shows and anthology series like The Twilight Zone and Alfred Hitchcock Presents. These often featured a brief, intriguing scene that set the tone for the episode. 1970s and 1980s, cold opens evolve into a standard practice in TV series across genre. Shows like MASH and The Simpsons popularized the technique, using comedic or dramatic setups that immediately grab the audience's attention. Cold opens also started to be used more creatively, often blending humor, action, or suspense. 1990s to 2000s, Cold opens become a staple in many popular TV shows, particularly sitcoms, dramas, and procedurals. Friends, The X-Files, The West Wing, and The Sopranos all feature memorable cold opens that establish tone, set up storylines, or introduce mystery. Cold opens with more humor or absurdity, for example, The Office, also gained popularity. 2010s to present, cold opens continue to thrive, with some shows adopting highly creative or experimental formats. For example, Game of Thrones uses cold opens for dramatic prologues, while Brooklyn Nine-Nine often uses humorous cold opens to set the tone for each episode. The technique also becomes a common feature in streaming shows, particularly with the rise of binge-watching, where the cold open encourages immediate engagement. In essence, the cold open has become a crucial narrative tool across media to capture attention quickly and establish mood or context for the story that follows. For many! You're asking about the timeline of a flagship TV station rather than the broadcasting company. A flagship TV station typically refers to a network's primary or most important station, often located in a major city. Here's a general timeline for such stations. Timeline of a flagship TV station. Launch, 1950s 1960s. A flagship TV stations are typically the first to air in a city, often becoming the primary station for a national broadcast network. For example, in the United States, NBC's WNBC in New York, ABC's WABC, and CBS's WCBS all served as flagship stations for their respective networks. Network expansion, 1960s 1980s. During this period, the flagship station serves as the home for many major television programs, helping shape the brand of the national network. Flagships often feature prime-time programming, news, and live broadcasts, becoming household names in their cities. Technological advancements, 1980s 1990s. Flagship stations begin to adopt new broadcasting technologies, including high-definition, HD, broadcasting, satellite feeds, and digital television. Flagship stations become the first to broadcast new programming styles and adapt to the changes brought about by the growing cable and satellite TV industries. Digital transition, 2000s. Flagship stations undergo the transition to digital television, often spearheading the move for their networks. They also launch their own digital sub-channels, allowing them to air additional programming like news, sports, or specialty shows. Streaming and digital content, 2010s present. In the age of streaming and on-demand content, flagship stations evolved by developing digital platforms for live streaming and on-demand viewing. Many flagship stations expand their brand with apps, websites, and social media, making them accessible on multiple devices. The integration of streaming into traditional broadcast formats becomes a key feature. A bumper in broadcasting refers to a short video or graphic used to separate different segments of a broadcast. Here's a general timeline for the development and use of bumpers in broadcasting. 1940s to 1950s. Early use. Bumpers were initially used to separate programs, often consisting of simple graphic logos or music cues. They were commonly used during transitions between shows on television networks. 1960s to 1970s. Refinement. Bumpers began to evolve with the use of more complex visuals and animations. These bumpers would often include the network's logo, show titles, or simple branding elements. 1980s increased complexity. The development of new animation and video technologies allowed for more intricate bumpers. Some networks began using bumpers not just for transitions, but also to promote upcoming shows or segments. 1990s creative innovation. Bumpers became more creative and varied, incorporating thematic elements related to the show or season. Networks like MTV and Nickelodeon were known for their unique bumper styles that helped establish the network's identity. 2000s high-definition CGI. With the advent of HD broadcasting, bumpers saw a shift toward higher-resolution graphics and the use of computer-generated imagery, CGI. This period also saw bumpers being used in more dynamic ways, with full-motion graphics and themed animations for different programming blocks. 2010s brand integration. bumpers became even more integrated with the brand identity of television networks, often including sleek animations and sound design to reinforce the tone of the network. Networks like Cartoon Network and Adult Swim became known for their unique, often avant-garde bumpers. 2020's streaming influence. With the rise of streaming services, bumpers are also used in platforms like Netflix and Disney Plus to mark the start of new episodes or breaks in viewing. Bumpers in streaming services tend to be minimalistic but serve as effective markers for transitions. Throughout the years, bumpers have evolved from simple logo screens to creative and artistic elements integral to a network's branding and viewer experience. For many, the history of morning news broadcasts can be traced back to the early days of television. Here is a general timeline of how morning news evolved. 1940s 1950s, early beginnings. 1948, the first ever morning television news program, The Today Show, premiered on NBC. It was created by Sylvester Pat Weaver and co-hosted by Dave Garroway. The program initially focused on a blend of news, human interest stories, and light entertainment, marking the birth of the morning news format. 1954, CBS launched the morning show, which eventually evolved into CBS This Morning. 1960s, expansion and competition. 1960s, as television became more widespread, the competition between networks for the morning audience grew. NBC's Today Show continued to dominate, but CBS and ABC developed their own morning programs, creating a larger morning news market. 1962, ABC introduced Good Morning America, which later became a significant competitor to the Today Show. 1970s 1980s, shift toward more structured formats. During these decades, morning news shows became more structured with dedicated segments, such as weather reports, traffic updates, and interviews. 1975, Good Morning America became a strong rival to the Today Show, especially after the introduction of new hosts and content that appealed to a broader audience. 1983, CBS This Morning introduced a more serious approach to news in the morning, catering to viewers who wanted a more in-depth, journalistic approach. 1990s, the rise of 24-hour news networks. The 1990s saw the rise of 24-hour cable news networks like CNN, which made news programming more accessible and provided a shift in how morning news shows were perceived. Morning news programs started to incorporate more live reports and in-depth analysis of global events. 1993, the early show was launched on CBS, attempting to offer a blend of hard news and human interest stories. 2000s, digital transition and interactive programming. The digital age began to influence the format of morning news broadcasts, with online streaming and live social media interaction becoming significant components of the show's interactivity. 2000s, morning shows became more diverse in their content offerings, focusing more on celebrity interviews, lifestyle segments, and social media buzz, all while continuing to deliver essential news updates. In this era, the morning news also began to focus more on entertainment, weather, and soft news, with the Today Show and Good Morning America continuing to lead in ratings. 2010s, social media and real-time news. The rise of social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook in the 2010s made morning news programs more interactive, with producers and anchors engaging directly with the audience through these platforms. News coverage in the mornings started to focus more on viral content, trends, and cultural moments, alongside breaking news. 2020s, streamlining and personalization. As streaming platforms grew in popularity, morning news shows adapted to reach audiences on digital platforms, allowing viewers to access content anytime. The focus shifted even more towards a blend of traditional hard news, lifestyle segments, and viewer engagement. Good Morning America and the Today Show remained the dominant morning programs, but smaller stations and alternative media also offered morning broadcasts in a more personalized and diverse format. The evolution of morning news reflects the broader changes in television, with a shift from formal, hard-hitting journalism to a more diversified mix of entertainment, news, and audience interaction. For many, here's a modified and more concise version of the timeline for simulcast based on the real history you've provided. Early developments and use of simulcasting. 1925, the term simulcast is first used. 1926, the BBC conducts early stereo radio experiments, broadcasting a Hulley Orchestra concert from Manchester using different radio channels for the left and right channels. 1926–1940s, BBC often transmits the same programs across both the national service and the regional network. 1949, NBC begins the first true radio, TV simulcast with its Voice of Firestone program. 1950s, simulcasting becomes more common, especially in classical and operatic performances, such as Toscanini's on NBC Symphony performances. Simulcasting for stereo sound on TV broadcasts. 1970, the Grateful Dead's Great Canadian Train Ride becomes the first live concert broadcast with an FM radio simulcast. 1972, the BBC broadcasts a live classical concert from the Royal Albert Hall on both BBC Two and Radio 3.1974, first rock concert simulcast. Van Morrison's London Rainbow Concert on BBC Two TV and Radio 2.1981. Frank Zappa's Halloween Show is the first cable TV concert simulcast with audio and FM radio. 1985, Live Aid concert is simulcast globally on TV and FM stations. Simulcasting in the 1980s–1990s. 1980, in Australia, commercial TV channels begin simulcasting music-based programs with FM stations. 1986, South African Radio 2000 begins simulcasting SABC1 programs, especially foreign shows. 1990–1994, the BBC offers a channel, Radio 5, that simulcasts various BBC radio channels. 1990s, early use of simulcasting in video games, with Nintendo's Satellaview providing simultaneous radio and game data broadcasts. Simulcasting in the modern era. 2001, WCW and WWF simulcast a segment from their respective flagship shows on March 26, setting up a storyline for the invasion angle. 2001 present, many sports and radio shows, such as The Howard Stern Show, are simulcast on both radio and television. 2010s, major sports networks and programs start offering alternative commentary and feeds through simulcasting, including ESPN's Eli and Peyton Manning Monday Night Football simulcasts. Present-day trends in simulcasting. Present, simulcasting is commonly used to maximize reach for large events like award shows, charity telethons, and in sports broadcasting, with networks offering alternative viewing options such as different camera angles or specialty commentary. This revised timeline covers the major milestones in simulcasting, from its early usage in radio to its modern-day applications in television and sports. For many, the history of sister stations refers to the relationships and development of television stations owned by the same parent company. These stations often share resources, programming, and sometimes broadcast content together. Here's a general timeline of how TV sister stations have evolved. 1. Early beginnings, 1920s, 1940s. The first TV stations began broadcasting in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Most stations were independently owned and operated. In the late 1940s, as TV became more popular, major networks like NBC, CBS, and ABC began to acquire multiple stations in different markets. 2. Post-war expansion. 1950s, 1960s. The growth of television networks led to the creation of regional affiliate networks, stations in different cities affiliated with national networks, sharing content but maintaining local ownership. This era saw the beginning of sister stations, where a group of stations, often in the same region, operated under the same corporate umbrella while keeping separate local brands. 3. Ownership consolidation. 1970s, 1980s. Major conglomerates began buying up smaller TV stations, leading to the consolidation of ownership. By the 1980s, large media companies like General Electric, Westinghouse, and Tribune began to own multiple stations in various cities. This marked the rise of TV groups and networks, which shared resources across their sister stations. 4. Cable and satellite growth, 1990s, 2000s. With the rise of cable TV, many major networks began to create their own channels, for example, ESPN, CNN, leading to more expansive ownership. In the 2000s, large media corporations like Viacom, News Corporation, now part of 21st Century Fox, and Universal acquired even more TV stations, further expanding their sister station networks. The digital transition and the rise of cable and satellite channels meant even local affiliates had to innovate and share content with other stations, further connecting sister stations. 5. Modern era and streaming, 2010s, present. The growth of streaming services has changed the landscape of television. Major media corporations now own both traditional TV stations and streaming platforms. Today, sister stations often refer to not only traditional broadcast networks but also digital platforms. For example, Universal owns both NBC Broadcast and Peacock Streaming, making them sister stations under the same parent company. Media mergers continue to shape the landscape, with large companies like Disney, Warner Media, and Comcast owning multiple TV stations and streaming services. Sister stations continue to play a vital role in how television programming is distributed and shared across different markets, often allowing for national content to be tailored to local audiences. For many,